Oh, hey, before we start the show, let me just mention that Mythic Bastionland is written by Chris McDowell with amazing art by Alex Sorensen, and you can find more information about the game at bastionland.com. The Smiling Fox, on the other side, is very much an unofficial fan project, a podcast by fans for fans, and in any case, you shouldn't trust the Smiling Fox. He's kind of a dodgy fella. Welcome to the Smiling Fox. I'm Horst,
I'm Brian.
And hey, I'm William.
and this is our second episode, The Unscripted Realm. Guys, I would like to talk with you about prep. Imagine that tomorrow you have to run the first game of a campaign. How would you spend your time efficiently?
The obvious thing is to create the map, and I don't think there's too much of a mystery around that. It's quite well explained in the book. There's a good procedure. Rolling a d12 to kind of set up the different terrain types and populating them. And I think most people who've done it seem to find it enjoyable. That's a nice thing about prep, if you can find a form of prep that you enjoy doing. It's been a while since I created a realm. I've got my map. I'm looking at my map currently, and I'm thinking back to when that happened. But the barriers can be a little bit of a potential confusion for people. I think the book says there's a barrier on 1 in 6 hexes. What I have seen on some maps that people create is they'll create a mountain range, and the barrier will just follow the course of the mountain range, so that there's essentially a large scale barrier running across the whole realm. What I did is I just went hex by hex and rolled a d6 and then decided based on that, should I put in a barrier in this hex?
I think I did something similar to Brian, where I just worked out how many barriers there should be, and then I rolled some dice to see where they go. But then I took a step back, looked at my map, and thought that there should probably be a few more, like around the mountain ranges. So I just added in a few extra. But I do think that the randomness does create more interesting things, whereas, putting them in around your mountain ranges does also feel like more fitting, I guess.
I think I need to correct myself. I think what I did is I looked at the map and I looked at groups of 6 hexes and then rolled a d6, and whichever, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for each hex, and added a barrier into whichever hex.
The first method you mentioned would mean that you could end up with 0 barriers.
Yes. However, I mean, I do have fairly random placement of barriers, and it has been quite rare that the company have encountered the barriers. I look at the map and I see all this wonderful labyrinth of you can't go that way, you have to go this way. I don't think they've really experienced it in that way.
Yeah, I have the same experience. But let me get back to clusters of terrain types. Do you roll randomly what kind of terrain type and how many of them occur?
I think when I made my first realm, I rolled pretty much everything. But then, like any good artist, you take a step back, you look at your masterpiece and you tweak things here and there. I think the spark tables were just like really useful. You can roll some random things and then find where on your map it makes the most sense. So for me, that was like a super easy way to make my first map.
The random selection of terrain type is great for going from having a blank page to having something. And then when you start to see parts of it look interesting or parts of it look a bit too weird, why is there a desert right beside this lush forest? Then maybe you start to make changes yourself.
So it's almost like a spark table. Your imagination is sparked by whatever randomness forces you to place down these terrain types, and then you maybe have to change a little bit. So the advice in the book is clusters of D12 hexes. During realm creation, there are obviously the landmarks. How do you go about it? You place your landmarks. Do you then use the prompts in the margins of the book to write down like 2 words? Do you flesh them out a little bit? How's the process?
I find with some landmarks, it has been sufficient to just have 1 or 2 words, and then when the company arrives at the landmark, then you can make some more rolls, or you can just in the moment think of something.
Do you pick a landmark, like, for example, there are dwellings in the margins, there are hazards in the margins, monuments, and so forth. Do you flip through the book and pick a random one?
For my hazards and curses, I think I just rolled for them. The dwellings, I wanted to have something a little more fleshed out, so at least when my party arrives, that I have something I can throw at them. So those I gave a bit more attention to and had them a little bit more fitting. Also, I like to have evocative names of the places where they stay. So I needed to spend a little bit of time doing that as well. But yeah, like I said, the curses and hazards, I rolled randomly and I just placed them in my world. And when the company arrives, I think of more stuff to make it more interesting. And so far, that has worked fine.
I have done the minimal version of this. So using the prompts on the bottom of the pages, I have taken 4 hazards, 4 curses. Each one, I've just taken one from the bottom of the page. And then there's 2 types in my mind, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, where you need a little bit more detail using the minimal approach. So for the sanctums, you need to know what seer is there. And for the ruins, you need to connect them to another myth. So for each ruin, I rolled a random myth and then just thought about, I'll give you an example. For one of my ruins, I have crumbled bridge, and the associated myth is the pack, which is a pack of wolves. And I just thought for a while, what would a broken bridge have to do with a pack? And I decided that some people were being pursued by the pack, and the only way to protect themselves was to destroy the bridge. So that is a little 1-sentence story that is combined with that ruin.
I find it interesting that both ruins and sanctums could work either way. You could go with the ruins, you could go myth, and then I just look at kind of the omens. If there's a location mentioned, I craft the ruin based on what the myth is. Or you go prompts in the margins. Mm-hmm. And with the seers, it's the same thing. You could go, oh, I have the swollen seer. I look at what their deal is, and I craft the sanctum based on that. Or I flip through the book, I have the swollen seer, but they are in the timeless cavern. How do you do that, William?
With the ruins, I specifically went to myths and then chose something that I thought would have been left behind after the myth. But that was mainly because I didn't even realize at that point that there were ruins in the margins of the book, which afterwards, reading through them, I found them way more evocative. With the seers, though, I'm happy and comfortable doing it in the structure that you first have the seer and then build something around them. I find that way easier than rolling on a sanctum and then trying to make it work in that way.
Brian, you did for the ruins, you did kind of both. So you had the prompt and you had the myth, and then you combined it in a way that made sense. And how did you do it for sanctums?
For sanctums, I began with the prompt for the location and then added in the seer. But it's worth saying that these are sparks, and by the time that the company reach this location, maybe they'll have heard some rumor about the seer, or maybe something else will have come up that changes the nature of what you eventually presented.
I think for following on that, I've had a similar experience where when I sat down to make my realm the first time around, I was trying to put a bunch of things in the world that feel cool and are interesting. But what I actually found is after playing a few sessions, you encounter a crazy person, and then it's cool if they then move over and start living next to, they move in with the seer essentially. And your players will say things that they'll hear about a seer sanctum, and they say, oh, it sounds like a beautiful place. And you can just take that and run with it. Your players will say things that work like spark tables that will give you thoughts. And I find that works much easier to expand your world and add more interesting details.
But we are still like imagining the game is tomorrow. And what I'm hearing is you guys are more austere. So 2 prompts maybe, but nothing really fleshed out. Is that also true for dwellings, for example? Do you add like a mayor or like a notable NPC, or would that come up while playing?
I find when I play, I'm really bad at coming up with names and 1 or 2 characteristics. So I usually pre-roll a few of those. But 9 times out of 10, when they arrive at a dwelling and you want to talk to someone, you will have some kind of idea of, is the person they're talking to going to be helpful in court politics, or are they going to be helpful in like knowledge of the wilderness? And you'll have a few of those criteria that will help you build out the character in the moment. So I find that generally for most places, 1 or 2 words or lines is sufficient. Again, like what I struggle with is names and characteristics. So I'll have a small table of those rolled up beforehand that I use to help me.
I'm feeling a little bit like maybe I'm risking too much with my prep, but my dwelling prep is the list of prompts that I've taken from the bottom of the page. So cartographer hut is one of them. That's it. That's all I have. If I were to do it, so this is what I have for the round that I'm running a campaign in. If I were to do this again, there's a new game starting tomorrow. I might think about it a little and see if something comes to mind. But right now I feel like it's sufficient for my style of play to just have that short prompt. And also it's not even likely that it will come up in the game. So
Brian, when I listen to your solo podcast, I find that you are like way better than me at coming up with interesting stuff when you encounter a new location, for example. It's been quite cool listening to how you just build out a location, make a few rolls, and then it's evocative enough that I can like imagine the location in front of me. So I think that your system works really well for the way that you play. And like you say, so far it's worked all right. And
my podcast is edited, so there are some pauses where I'm thinking about things, but I'm deliberately not doing preparation for that so that the preparation is audible. I think I'm running that a little bit differently to how I do when I have a group.
And I think that rolling everything and then pondering on it in a game where you're refereeing for other people is completely different to the solo experience. In the solo experience, you can take as much time as you want, whereas my players would riot if I'm sitting there 10 minutes thinking about what could this mean.
Probably the best thing about solo playing is you can take your time with things and reinterpret things. And probably what I do in the real setting with a group is I will think briefly about a thing. I won't. There's a certain time pressure, even though the group are very understanding. So I might go with the first thought that I have. And sometimes I feel like I'm taking a chance on this. I don't know if this is going to work. Sometimes you don't need something. You don't need a great deal of complexity to what you're presenting. You just need what is the next step. It doesn't need to be, I know where this will lead, I know where that will lead. It's just something to move forward a little bit.
About that though, to me, like prep can be very useful in providing players with opportunities. So for example, they have the oath, which is honor the Seers. Well, we have the sanctums, seek out the myths. We have placed those. But what about protecting the realm? Like if there's no prep concerning something that they can do to protect the realm, is that something that you would then come up in the moment? Like you have a dwelling and then you think about what could be their woe, or do you roll on that? Because that seems to be something for me that could be like useful prep.
But when you protect the realm, so far my games have mainly been just dealing with the myths. I remember the very first game I ever ran, I had the wyvern, and when my company arrived at a small dwelling, those people knew that there was a creature around because it was eating the wild creatures in the forest, making hunting more difficult. So in that sense, it was a very natural, like, emergent story of these people worried about this creature. And in that way, the knights had a very clear goal to protect these people.
I can see that, but it's kind of cheating. The cheating is they can fulfill their oath by just doing one thing. And what I would like to see is maybe some kind of choice. Do I don't know, fight the bandits or, follow the kind of mundane trouble that dwelling has, or will I go and fight the wyvern? That seems to me an interesting choice that you could, provide for the players by prepping a little bit more.
What I would say is we've got into this topic talking about, you have a session tomorrow and you're prepping now. So although I think it would be good to strive for those kind of decisions in the long term, if you have an idea, sure, put it in. But I don't think at least starting off, I don't think it's really necessary to place it in the game. And when you have cool ideas, you can place them in and that'll happen over time.
I think you have convinced me when creating dwellings to roll for a woe as well. I will say that up until now, I've been thinking about dwellings primarily as being like a hermit or somebody living on their own in the wilderness. The way you're describing it sounds like you're more leaning towards multiple people, like a small community. Is that correct?
You have 3, I want to say, dwellings in your realm by the realm creation process. And for these major settlements, I roll a woe.
I like that, yeah. I think assigning some problem, essentially, to each dwelling makes sense. Wherever there are people, there should be a problem that potentially will get presented.
Speaking about problems and people, we come to the big part of prep. If you want to put your extra effort in realm creation, you can get wild with holdings. So I think we talked a lot about it last time, and I think we all do the relationship things. Anything else you do? How many NPCs do you name? Probably the ruler, extended council members, anything like that?
I have 2 answers. So I did the prep that I did before the campaign started, which was by the book. So kind of rolling for the holding, Bailey, the ruler, a drama, and it's quite light. I'm looking at what I have for the seat of power, and it's only a few sentences, but there's enough there to handle the initial interactions. Then we played for maybe 5 sessions, and I knew that they were approaching a different holding, and I had time to prep. So I made a map with a little point crawl of a town, and I added in locations, which I didn't write anything for them, but I had in my mind what they were. I populated the whole council, so they're mostly knights. 1 or 2 of them are not knights. And then I wrote, what I've written down here is holding fronts. I think the front terminology is coming from Dungeon World, maybe. And I have 2 of those. So, for example, which I called holding a grudge, was they were traveling with a soldier. He was just part of their party who they were on some journey with him. And I had the idea that someone in the holding would know him and have a grudge against him from the civil war that happened in the past. And a few different developments that could happen where he's being followed and someone challenges him. That's a lot of prep by my standards.
That is a lot of prep, and it almost sounds like grim portents, which are almost like omens. So there are things that will happen in an escalating fashion. Is that how you did it, or is it more like mean tables where you can randomly pick one of the results?
No, it's an escalation. I haven't played Dungeon World, so I'm not sure at what point I thought I'll use this terminology. But yeah, it's probably definitely influenced by the idea of a myth. So you're seeing the initial, this feeling, am I being followed, culminating in, someone murders him in his bed one night.
Brian, you said that you made knights for the whole council. Would you say that you've played enough that has paid off? That they've all got some screen time?
Yeah, this is something I want to point out about the holding prep in particular. I've been glancing through. I've been running this campaign for a while. I've been glancing through the notes I initially made. I've completely forgotten about the hazards I don't remember what hazards I rolled. If I needed them, I would look them up and use them. But all of the prep I did for the holdings is kind of at the front of my mind because it has been so useful and it's still useful. So these are characters who have been around for a while. One of them grew old and died. So creating the council was definitely very useful.
Do you do the three holding, Bailey, and keep?
I think I only did that for my seat of power because I wanted the feel of the other holdings to be like they are more outposts than like actual civilization. The way that I framed it is that the seat of power has approximately 1,000 people living there, whereas the other holdings have about 100. So the size diminishes quite substantially. So I don't think I rolled on all three of those except for the seats of power.
I have done that for all of them. They're quite useful. For example, the keep in my seat of power, I got cauldron and silver. And what we have in the center of the keep is a cauldron of water that is always boiling, and there's no fire beneath it. So it's kind of a mystical, ever boiling cauldron. And the festivals that occur tend to have some kind of ritual that involve people, throwing something into the cauldron, and it's a symbol for the whole realm that this is this magical thing at the center of everything.
I got so much mileage from just the two words. I had, I think I got Wild Dome, and that became like a major place within the holding, like an old abandoned game hall that have hints of the old king and, tunnels underneath. And, just two words, haven't thought about it for a second, but when it came up in the game, I thought, wow, this has potential.
I mentioned that I created a map for one of the holdings, which I'm not suggesting is necessary or anything. I'm just curious, have either of you done that?
I haven't, no.
I haven't created a map, but so I made a second realm just because I enjoyed it so much. And there I did make a site for one of the holdings, but that's because I wanted to illustrate that the northeastern half of the holding was entirely destroyed. And for superstitious/religious reasons, the people are very adverse to fixing that. So I wanted some kind of map representation, and I just thought a site would be the easiest thing to do.
I think a site is a great idea for holding, actually. I don't think a site necessarily needs to be a danger. It's just a place with a little bit more depth to it.
I mean, going back to our initial question, which is, what would you prep if you have a game tomorrow and, limited time, obviously? I don't think neither of us would do a site, or would we?
If you had asked me this question a few months ago, I would have said probably not. But now I've started making them more and more, and it's actually really fun. So I probably would make one or two.
And then you would have like a one that you can drop in whenever it feels useful.
Oh, if I was running a game tomorrow, I would probably have a bit of a feel for, depending on where the night starts, what would be closest, and I might make one or two close by there.
You pick the entry point for your knights, and then you also have like a site in the vicinity. And the problem with giving them an entry point is they will assume that there's a preferred direction. That there's this holding in the vicinity. He wants us to go there, or there's the site. He wants us to go there, and I don't want them to go anywhere. I want them to have the feeling of total freedom, and that's why I roll the entry point.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said for that play style. I think because I play a lot of one-shots, it's just easier to introduce the people into a game in where the first half hour or so is I can somewhat build up and I know a little bit of what's going to happen, and then I try and make as many branching paths as possible. And I find that in that way, I'm still quite surprised by what they do.
And so maybe we can use the opportunity to talk about prepping one-shots versus prepping a campaign. So for a campaign, probably 12 by 12. And for a one-shot, would you go... I know that, Brian, you only ran one-shot, I think. Did you do a small one, a small map?
I did a 6x6 map for a one shot that I ran, and I started them in a random location, as you're suggesting. It just the only restriction on it was that it was on the border, the kind of the outside of the map. But I did give them a kind of a starter quest, which was very simple, which was that the common thing between all these people in the group is that they had all been trained by the same knight, and that knight had died, and they were returning their ashes to their home. So it was just an excuse to travel, really, but it gives them, firstly, a connection to each other, and if anyone was inclined to roleplay, they're grieving someone that they knew, and they had a destination to get to. So, and from then on in, it was just dealing with myths.
And William, you're our expert for one-shots.
My realm is a bunch of islands, so it's easier for me to just start the players on one island. The very first one-shot I did, I kind of just presumed that they would remain on the main island. It was I could have come up with something like it was bad weather, the boats weren't sailing to the other islands. Subsequently, I've kind of given them more of a nudge to head to the other places and explore what's happening over there. I think for a one-shot, a 6x6 is fine, but if you want to, like, you can just go ahead and have a full realm. The way that I solve the randomness of the myths then is I would have like a myth per region and then have one radiant myth. The mist is a good example of a radiant myth where you can pepper those in here and there instead of rolling for a random myth. And then the main story will be depending on where they are. And I think that's quite a satisfying way that you can do a one-shot and still have, still be surprised as a referee.
But I mean, if you have a lot of islands and you start them on one island and there's a myth on that one island, will they have a reason to leave?
Well, in my last one-shot, they wanted to get off the island pretty quickly because part of the introduction was them hearing about stuff happening on other islands. And they said, wow, it sounds much, much more fun on that other place. Let's head out there. And they very quickly started a sea voyage.
And then do you make a new realm for every one shot because realm creation is fun, or do you use the same one and just maybe make it more detailed?
I have the same realm for my long-term game and for my one-shots, and I use the things that they do in the game to build it out. So I have a lot of ruins of things they've come across. A lot of the people they come across are from myths. Depending on what they do in the one-shots, that'll like affect change. The second realm that I have built is kind of just in my pockets for if they're ever shunted into a new realm or if they decide to leave this realm, which is also an option.
All right, and then Brian, you are our expert concerning long campaigns. Do you even prep in between sessions? And if so, what do you prep?
The most important thing in my mind is to review what has happened in the previous session. It's that primacy of action idea that whatever the players are concerned with is the most important thing that's going on, even if I want them to engage with a weird idea that I have cooking. So review what they've done, and if I have a sense of what they might do next, then I might prepare a site, for example, if I think they're going to a place where a site would be useful. I also have, to some extent, used clocks where I'll know that one example was a seer had chosen a child as their successor, but the parents didn't want to give up the child. So I had a countdown where if there isn't an intervention, then the seer's acolytes will come and try and take the child. And in between sessions, I would roll to see whether that advances or not.
Interesting. It's a little bit of a take on what is already advised in the book, because in between sessions, you're supposed to roll whether an unresolved conflict escalates. You could have done that as well, but you wanted like a shorter term countdown clock.
Unresolved situations can be quite final. It can say, here's the answer. Well, I guess you're free to interpret it, but I think it's mostly geared towards, does it get worse? Does it get better? But if you want to have, an event that's happening over the course of days, I think it's good. Does this journey get completed? Does this person reach this location? I definitely used the unresolved situations heavily between seasons. Changing between ages is probably another conversation, because I think that can be quite complicated.
Assuming tomorrow is our hypothetical start of a campaign, let's say, you will also play 6 myths. 2-part question. Do you curate your myths to pick the ones that, for whatever criteria you have? And second part of the question, do you prep the omens? Do you read through the whole thing? Do you flesh out the omens?
Yeah, you're going to hate this answer, Horst, but I'm a very big fan of curating myths. I think the first time I ran, I rolled 8 myths and then chose the 6 that I thought would be the most fun. Also, because I was coming to the game, I wanted something that I at least understood how to run. If there's a myth that sounds really dope to you, just pick it and put it in your game. It's fun. I think there is benefit also in just reading through the omens and especially the random table. I often forget that's in play, but those can be really, really useful. I don't think I would prepare too much, actually have it on paper, but I feel that most of the time when I read through them and I have them in the back of my head going into the session, that is sufficient for me to come up with some cool stuff.
I have always rolled them randomly and read through them, but I would read through them and then I would probably forget the details until it's relevant. Coming back just to the question about between sessions, I do often read the next omen in each of the myths because it's the next likely thing that I'm going to have to deal with. I've seen people talking about preparing the omens in some way, like thinking about how they'll present them and maybe rolling on spark tables and adding in more detail to them. You don't really know where the players are going to be, and you don't know whether they'll encounter something when they're camping at night or whether they're galloping through the countryside in a rush to get somewhere. To me, I don't particularly want to prepare them, but it sounds to me to be hard to prepare them. Horst, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think that prep in general is like a bad idea, thinking about the omen and how they would present themselves. But as you said, it is almost impossible to prepare it in like a general way that is, on the one hand, detailed, and on the other hand, will fit the situation where it will occur. In general, I think that is the problem that is kind of the problem and the benefit of prep is it should feel light enough that you are still flexible to adjust it to the situation.
I have one exception to this, and this is not something I've done yet, but it's an idea I'm thinking about, because the campaign is going for a while and we have a large cast of NPCs. And I have considered that maybe it would be good to, when an omen is encountered, to include an NPC there from a previous, someone they met in some previous circumstances who is somehow tangled up in the myth. And I think that could be a good way to keep people active. It's very easy to have an interesting NPC and then no one sees them for a while and people forget who they are, and you're trying to say, oh, remember, you like this guy, you met him here, and they're like, I have no idea who that is. So I'm toying with that idea, but I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I do have some notable NPCs that arose from omens. It would feel pretty weird to connect them to now a different myth.
I think the simplest way to do it is if it's a knight, for example, you could have a knight who is traveling around the realm, fulfilling the oath, and they have every reason to get involved in anything that could be happening. But if it's a random fisherman who was once attacked by the Hydra and now he's being attacked by a different strange animal, then that would be quite strange.
It's actually funny you say that, because after the last session that I played, I had this idea of a company of 2 knights and their squire, and having just a note somewhere in my file. And at any point, if I don't know how to make an omen more interesting, or if the players get lost or whatever, I can have these guys just randomly show up, and then I can have, because I do a lot of one shots, I can have them as like they pop up in every one shot at least one scene. So people that sign up for multiple sessions, they'll meet the same people again. So it's funny that you now mentioned this as a way to like introduce NPCs into omens when it's something that I've been toying with in the back of my mind as well.
You curate your myths based on, do you find them fun? Are there other criteria?
For my long-term game, not really. I just toss them in. For the one-shots, I try and have the myths that are linked to islands, I have as high actionable, I would say. Whereas the Radiant myth needs to be something that's more weird. I gave the example of the mist. If you're trying to track down the wyvern and all of a sudden a mist rolls in, you can still, that still makes sense. So in that sense, I do curate depending on what type of myth it is, and then what role it needs to take in the game I play.
Do you exclude myths because they wouldn't be fun in a one shot? And what would be the reason?
We talked briefly about the glade, which I don't know how I could make that work in a one shot. I think my players would be more confused.
Yeah, so maybe spoiler alert for the glade. There are in the glade the knights will be asked 3 questions in succession, and the answer to the question will have repercussions for NPCs in the realm. And you're saying if they don't know any notable NPCs, the question will be kind of irrelevant.
Although I will say the last time I restocked the map, I did roll randomly, and I went for some myths that were, let's say, a little bit out of that comfort zone, where they're less actionable, but still in a way that I feel that I can have them work in a one shot and somewhat resolved.
I'm interested in the word actionable. So when you say actionable, does that mean, are you leaning towards combat, or would it be more general than that?
I would say the combat myths are high actionable. It's easy for my players to know how to resolve it in that sense. There are some that are a little bit more court related that I think would work as well. Whereas I think the river and the mist aren't super high actionable. It's almost like we would have to resolve it in an epilogue than in the encounter itself. Again, given the time constraints of a one-shot, I don't know if that would be satisfying compared to having it in a campaign where we can, in the next session, we can find clues and try and resolve it in a way that's more satisfying.
Yeah, my argument would be for some people going through almost like a story, like let's say you would have a one shot with just one myth, and you have the satisfaction of resolving the myth at the end, but you never have the feeling of actually making a lot of meaningful choices because you are, by design of the omens, you're railroaded towards a satisfying ending. Whereas I think the strength of Mythic Westerland is the sandboxy character, and I'm not sure if you can retain that feeling in a one shot. I mean, you have different myths, obviously, but you want them to resolve one of them. You kind of have to push them towards the resolution.
Yes, you bring up good points, because I feel like I'll be the first to admit that my one-shots are way more railroady than the average Mythic Bastionland game. That being said, I think that the color of the omens or the location it takes place are interesting enough that despite being on a quote-unquote railroad, the game is still interesting in that sense. Again, the example of the wyvern, when I ran that in my first one-shots, I didn't place the myth on a hex. It was up to the players of where it would take place. So in that sense, there is a bit of freedom. It could have happened in the mountains or the meadows or the forest, and the final encounter would have been somewhat different depending on where they were and who they talked to, would they get backup or not. Eventually they had a squire and a warband on their side. I didn't know that was going to happen when I started, but because of, again, like the freedom of the game, the way the omens get filled in and the way the myth plays out over time, there is still a lot of freedom in that sense.
That sounds like a quantum ogre thing. What I'm hearing with my, OSR referee brain is they wouldn't be able to cut through the last omen because there is no hex myth.
In that one shot, they skipped, I think, myth 5, maybe also myth 4, because they had prepped a lure for the wyvern. I think they chained a sheep to the ground or something like that, so it couldn't run away. So in that sense, again, like they can rush forward, and like primacy of action, it made sense that the creature would be attracted to the lure. So I can then move forward and just have that as well. I think the omens structure gives me enough freedom that I can still do that. In fact, I know what I'm saying sounds very railroady. I think about 80% of the one-shots I've done, I've skipped at least one omen just because they were, hunting down the threat, and it just made sense to have things move in a faster pace.
Do you prep like useful hints for the seers? So you have read the omen, and you can assume that at some point in a campaign, maybe in a one-shot, they will visit a seer. Do you have any idea what the advice could be, and how helpful is the advice?
I sometimes worry that when I give seer advice, it's too direct. The first time my players encountered a seer, it was a little bit railroady. The seer essentially said, I have seen a vision of you going to this place and taking part in a great battle. Because the final omen that they were working towards was a battle. The seer said, I've foreseen that. Now, they could have said, well, forget that. We're not going to go get killed in a battle and go in another direction. But for whatever reason, they chose to go to that location. There was a battle, and it resolved the myth. And then another occasion where a seer, they asked a seer for help. The seer was weird, and there was a whole complicated, strange scene. But essentially, the seer told them, go to this location, and then you'll confront the antagonist here. And I do worry that sometimes I'm a bit too direct with that. So I'm interested to hear other ideas on it.
I try and run my seers as drug dealers, where the first taste is free, and afterwards it's you got to do something for me before you get help again. And the limited visits that my players have had, or the limited visits my company has had with the seers, that's actually worked quite well. An example is the serpent seer. Literally says in the stat block that they want to collect rare serpents. So my players in my long-term game now know that they need to bring a rare snake if they want to get help from the serpent seer. And in that way, I can keep it interesting, and it's not super railroady in the sense of I'm not directly pointing them, because it is kind of like they're doing something and they're getting help in return.
But if they visit the seer, do you have like you say that they are essentially drug dealers? So the first hint is free, but then the first hint is prepared by you, and you know that what they will say, and it will be helpful.
I don't prep it in that sense, but the prep that I do for the seers is just thinking of how to portray a creepy NPC. I find thinking it over and maybe just going over some of the lines that they'll say is useful. And that's pretty much the max of the prep that I'll do. And I find that the rest is, I'm fine with improving that in the moment.
And Brian, how helpful are they in your campaign? I'm hearing not really helpful.
No, they're quite helpful, but the players don't engage with them very much. Which is kind of, it seems strange.
This is strange. They are so interesting and they're useful. Why not visit them? What did you do to your players?
My players just are particularly interested in finding their own solutions to problems. And I think maybe it's because the seers on a couple of occasions have been quite helpful, that they're like, I don't really want the answer. I want to find the answer. The most interesting things that have happened with the seers in my game have not necessarily been linked to help us with this myth. So that episode where a seer was looking for they were old and they were dying, they were looking for an heir, and that was a kind of a drama linked to one of the holdings, and that spread over several sessions, and there was interactions with the seer. There was kind of a negotiation. They were trying to convince the seer to take a different choice, a different person for their heir. So they're living characters in the realm with their own desires. So they're not just pointers, saying go here and do this, even though I have felt at times I'm falling into that trap.
So there is sometimes the question of, do you give your players fetch quests, which is kind of a derogatory term, but it is a way to have the knights kind of work for the good intel. So William had the serpent seer who is looking for rare snakes. Brian, have you had a fetch quest?
The closest thing is I had one player, their knight died, so they were then started playing as a squire, and they played as a squire very patiently for many sessions. Eventually, the seer said to them, he asked the seer, "How can I become a knight?" And she gave him a quest, which I thought would lead to him fighting another knight, a knight who had kind of strayed from the oath. It didn't lead to combat. It was quite dramatic what happened, but I thought that was quite an interesting kind of side quest where he had to go and confront another knight, and if he resolved that well, then he would be knighted.
Okay, so let's maybe finish the topic of prep. We have talked mostly about prepping the realm because that's the kind of prep that is kind of assumed in the book. Would you prep anything else? I know that we in the first episode we stressed the fact that the book has enough elements that you can use for the game and it will run really smoothly. But could you imagine prep that would improve the experience? So, for example, what about deep lore? What about the history of the realm? You mentioned, Brian, a civil war. What is that about?
Yeah, so the recent history of my realm is that there was a civil war and the current ruler was a stranger who came into the midst of that conflict, so not one of the established people in the realm, and is such a great warrior that they won that conflict and they became the new ruler. So I had at the beginning of the campaign, no one trusted them. They saw them as the outsider and they were fearful of them because they're this warrior. And that was very helpful. And it was quite light. I mean, I didn't write a whole cast of characters. I didn't say there was this battle. There was, I didn't even name who the antagonists were in this fight. Sometimes when I think about my prep, I think it's paper thin, and there's a risk that I'll run out of things, and maybe I do sometimes. I don't want to give the opinion though, or the false impression that I don't do weird, obtuse prep that doesn't see the light of day, because in the question you mentioned deep lore, and I have thought about particularly one of the myths that involved a very ancient being. I have a note in my phone that describes something that happened thousands of years ago, and this is my Silmarillion style background to the realm that has never really featured anywhere. I do daydream about that stuff. It's there to kind of pull on if I need it, but I don't consider it to be all that relevant to the living game. My attitude is if the players don't see it, if they're not aware of it, then it's not really part of the game. It's just me daydreaming.
Just a follow-up question. What is the advantage for having like a recent civil war? I have a similar concept in my realm, but why did you choose that?
I see it as being kind of like a reset for the realm. So you're not coming into, this is there have been 10 generations of this king, like that dynasty. This is somebody new who's ruling, and everything that's the major politics of the realm are all linked to one issue, which is that the war has just ended. So for me, it's a relatively simple background, even though, I mean, the civil war can be extremely complex, but for me, here's just one touchstone that I can relate things to if I need a bit of guidance on, is this person loyal to this holding or loyal to that holding? Do they have any grudges from the war, those sorts of things.
And it also sounds to me like that the status quo is not as settled as if you had like 10 generations of the same ruler. There has been a recent change, and who's to say that there will be another change soon? So that seems to me that the power balance is a bit more fragile.
And it's something I think if I was starting fresh, if I was doing a new campaign, I would consider this, which is that over the first few sessions, I feel like a theme started to develop in the various things that were going on, which was the aftermath of this war. So not necessarily just the political side of it, but characters who were tired of fighting and didn't want to fight anymore, and those kinds of ideas. I don't know if you said to my players, what was the theme of your campaign? I don't know, would they answer in that way? Maybe they wouldn't consider it or think of it in that way. But for me, I find that helpful, to have something that is not restraining the story, but giving guidance when I need to make decisions on what happens next.
So if you would start anew, you would also pick some kind of event.
Not exactly an event, but a theme. So the theme could be renewal, or the theme could be forgiveness or something. Like something that is so vague, it doesn't actually specify, here's a bunch of things you need to know, but it might just be a little bit of flavor when I'm creating a new NPC or creating some detail of something that I can draw on that. And in my mind, which I'm entertaining myself as well as the players, to me it feels like I'm building something a little bit connected.
And William, do you think it would be cool to have something like a nemesis on arch enemy, or would that something that just kind of emerges through play?
The way that I would play, I don't think I would place that in, because for me, it's much easier to have a session and then afterwards kind of listen, after I've listened to what my players have said and the way in which they've resolved a myth, I can use that to then maybe have some kind of a nemesis arise. I think something more vague, like a theme, is a better idea than actually having some kind of entity that you want to have reoccur. Again, wait until you've run 2, 3, maybe 4 sessions, and then that'll be much more, I think, much easier and much better linked back to what the Knights have already done.
And I think we mentioned dungeons in the first episode as well. I mean, not even talking about mega dungeons. That seems by design to be a bit weird to have like such a big element of the game. But could you imagine like a smaller dungeon location, almost like a site, that you take from an OSAR module, maybe?
I've looked at a few modules that I thought I could maybe port into Mythic Bastionland that had a strange and mythic feel to them. And I feel there's like a disconnect. I feel the reason the sites work so well is because they maintain the same level of analysis. I would really not enjoy my players arrive at a location and me saying, right, who wants to map out this dungeon? That feels to me like you're then switching over to a totally different system and losing a lot of the mythical narrative elements of the game. The best I've got is 1 or 2 locations on a site where I then have to build out the rest myself. But that being said, I'm not opposed to the concept of having a session or 2 where you're delving into a mythic underworld location to retrieve a holy relic or someone who's been kidnapped or something of the sorts. At the point I'm at now, I think the sites are a better way to solve that issue than to have a kind of more traditional dungeon setup.
So what I'm hearing is it's scale on the one hand, like a site is smaller in scale than even a smaller dungeon, and I hear kind of theme or let's say mood or vibe. So if you would take a dungeon, it would be too big. Things that are not relevant for Mythic Bastion, like resource management, all of a sudden becomes relevant. And you would introduce kind of vibes from a different world into your world. Is that the main criticism?
I'm okay with introducing different vibes in a narrative sense. I don't think it makes sense to introduce a different vibe in a gameplay sense. I think that will slow down, and to me that makes it less mythic in the way that Mythic Bastion Land really stands out.
I don't think I would rule anything out completely and say this can't be done or this shouldn't be done. I recently had a session where there was a big naval battle, and I prepared that in advance. I took a rule from Pirate Borg. There is stuff already in Mythic Bastion Land about boats, but I wanted some extra rules for sailing around. It was very prepared. You know, there was a grid, there was weather effects in Owlbear Rodeo. It wasn't what I normally do, but it was kind of a special session. We just advanced time, so I wanted to do something a bit different. And it's not the sort of thing I would have thought starting out, I'm going to do a naval battle in this campaign. So I would say maybe when you're playing this game for a while and you think it would work in your game and you want to do a mega dungeon, go for it. But I definitely don't think it's something that you need to be considering at the outset. Because I think before you play Mythic Bastion Land, we talked about this a lot in the first episode, you may not know exactly how it's going to play. And there's no sense in building a big, well, if it's an existing module, you want to have it in reserve by all means. But you may get a different feel for the game after you've played it for a few sessions and then see whether or not that's something you want to do.
I think we explored the topic of prep pretty thoroughly. Is there anything about prep that you want to add?
Once I played a few sessions, I thought, hey, it would have actually been better if I had done A or B instead of what I actually did. And then I incorporated that into my second realm.
And Brian, what would you do differently if you were to start a new campaign? Would you do realm creation differently?
An idea I've seen a couple of times, I think Horst, you mentioned it in a previous conversation, and I've seen it on the Discord as well, is the idea of having powerful families within the realm. Because what I essentially have is 4 holdings they do have relationships between them in the sense of this person is an enemy or this is a secret ally or those sorts of relationships. But when you get into a new holding, you're kind of learning it all from scratch. Whereas if you get there and you know that this is the family of the ruler who they have the position of steward or whatever, then you have something to hold on to. And I am conscious that as the game goes on, as any kind of open world game extends for many sessions, there's a lot of stuff for players to remember. It can become quite complicated. And the way I think about it is like, there's all these weird ideas that I have that are in my head that are not part of the game because they haven't been presented at the table. And then they become part of the game when I share them with the players and when they contribute their own ideas and it all combines together. And then there's also like an exit for stuff in the game. Like people will just forget about something that happened. And I think it can become a little bit unfair to try to keep bringing things back and say, you should have known this because a year and a half ago, this guy said that. So you've screwed up here. I think you have to accept that some things will be forgotten. And that's part of long-term play.
That is true, although my instinct is always to tell them what they should have remembered, rather than just letting it go and having it disappear from the realm. I will just say, remember the clue that the seer gave you, it's south of the other point. And they say, oh yeah, of course. I also have a blog, so I can point them to the blog and say, well, that was in session 11. And they do that on their own accord. So they are actually actively on the blog and fact check me when I give them a reminder of what had happened.
That does link to my second thought about what I would do differently. Is my note taking is quite poor. And I have multiple times in this campaign thought, okay, this system isn't working. I'll transition all of my notes into some other new tool that I think is fancy. Sometimes things get lost along the way. I think if I was doing this from scratch, I would have a notebook with a 2-page spread for the map and a 2-page spread for each holding and a page for each notable NPC or whatever. Keep it real simple and keep it unified in one place. I don't know if we said it yet or whether we said it enough. The preparation you do in Mythic Bastion Land can be very long-lived. Like you can roll on a spark table on the day before your campaign starts, and a year later, that's relevant information that is going to guide what happens in the session. So don't throw things away, and don't throw sites away. If you think maybe they'll go to this mountain, or maybe they'll go into this cave in a bog, and you build a site and they don't go there, keep that site, because they might come back to that place, and it's useful to have that stuff.
Yeah, I would agree that the initial realm creation is the most prep I've ever done for Mythic Bastionland. You get so much mileage of the landmarks and the relationship between holdings and all the stuff that, I don't know, takes you maybe an hour. And essentially, I haven't really prepped anything since then. I updated stuff. I think that is one of the reasons why we kind of focused on realm creation this episode. Thorough realm creation, maybe adding a woe for the dwellings, maybe adding drama to the court, having houses in my campaign worked wonders for the kind of power balance. Maybe having a recent event, or as Brian suggested, a theme to the campaign can give you material to work with. I want to mention a blog post that I saw that was about prepping your first session in a campaign by Elmcat. We can put the link in the show notes. Very thorough overview of what you should prep and what you don't have to prep. And there was one thing that made me think that if I would prep a realm the next time, I might actually start with barriers.
I think also one thing that a lot of people miss when it comes to barriers is that sometimes locals know of ways to circumvent or to, the secret pathway through the barrier, which is something I played through a bunch of sessions, and then I went back to the book and reread that segments. And I immediately thought, oh, of course, people close by would know how to, climb up the cliff. So I think barriers are somewhat underutilized in my game. Where I placed majority of them up in mountains or what would be a cliffside. But I think it's also a really cool reward for people interacting with NPCs to now know how to circumvent the barrier.
So let's get to our last segment, You Be the Judge. I think, Brian, you have a situation that you want us to judge.
So this is something that came up in my solo play. So I am both the referee and the player in this scenario. I was moving characters through a site, and there was a particularly challenging, dangerous path that they had to follow. And for one character in particular, this was difficult because of some characteristics of this character. So I said that they were able to move through it without having to do a roll, but that it cost them spirit loss. And I rolled D6 spirit loss because they were so tense and paying so much attention to their footing as they moved through this. I did that with myself as a player and was comfortable with it. I'm not particularly comfortable with doing that with my group. I don't think my group like that. There's scenarios in the game itself, like moving through a hazard where it's in the rules that you lose a virtue. But how are you with kind of GM fiat deciding that virtue loss is called for? Is that something that you use sparingly, or do you let loose and hit them with it?
I think it's an interesting question because it comes up regularly on the Discord that people feel that the traveling procedure is kind of trivial, that it's not taxing enough. And I think Chris also made a blog post to make the whole experience a bit more gruesome. I'm happy with suggesting a virtue loss and also giving them alternatives. So if you would say, well, you travel the path and subtract D6 clarity from your virtues, that would feel, I don't know, unfair. If I tell them you can either, follow the path and get the virtue loss, or you pick a different route, then I give them the options, and then it's their decision.
William, do you have a take on this?
I think in play, I don't do it as often as I probably should. The last one shot I did, they made a decision to get really close to a cabin, and the spectre burst out of the cabin, and it kind of washed over all of them. And I felt that I telegraphed the danger well enough that I just rolled straight for a virtue loss instead of being very clear with, do this or else this will happen. So I think what you did in your game is fair, because I can see the knights going through this trial and coming out burdened by it. And it makes sense to me that they would have accepted this fate. So in that sense, it's correct. But I think in-game, it's way more satisfying to give your players a moment to think about the threats and how to possibly mitigate it as much as possible.
By the way, Brian, was that a hazard? Could the knight have come up with a way to maybe proceed with a clever idea without getting the virtual loss?
It was actually a blocked path in a site. So I don't think the rules are very specific about it. There is some obstacle on this path and you need to overcome it. And they had previously done some investigation to find a way through, but it was still, I didn't want it to be too easy. It's not just, you spend time looking around and you see how to go and then you go.
Maybe a follow-up question. Do you feel that traveling is not difficult enough? Does it feel like trivial?
I don't think that at all. I've never had the experience where they're traveling with no purpose. And I think sometimes people who are playing the game for the first time experience that, where the players are wandering around, in some cases maybe looking for a myth hex, which I don't consider to be the objective of the game. So anytime my players are going anywhere, it's usually because they have some goal in mind. They want to go to the other holding to meet someone. They want to go see a seer, whatever it is. And the travel is filled with incident and interesting stuff because of the way the wilderness role works. We played a lot of sessions in winter. We might talk about time at another occasion. Our winter extended bizarrely long. It was kind of George R.R. Martin style winter, and it's very hard to travel in winter, which is interesting. But I wouldn't want that throughout the whole game.
Well, one thing also is what I found is when knights are traveling, they're not replenishing their virtues very easily. So if you take a hit to spirit or clarity during travel, it might be a while before you get that back. And the few times where I've had that happen, it's been rather impactful on the way that the players play those knights that have had those hits to their virtues.
I would agree. I think that virtual loss occurs eventually, and then it will really hurt. And I think that maybe if you're playing a shorter campaign or a one-shot, it might feel too easy. And then maybe for a one-shot, you can even make travel more difficult. But in my experience, what I like about the game is the kind of meditative vibe of traveling, like describing the landscape, encountering the omens, and that kind of fairy tale feel for me is enough. And then when virtual loss occurs, I think in the last session, one of my players fought a Herald of the Elf, and the character got a scar, and that was a spirit loss. That character is now broken. They have 0 spirit after they got lost in the mountains as well. And that feels much more impactful for the story if it occurs, sporadically and has then big consequence for the player character and how they are played, than if, like mundane traveling from one place to the other feels kind of gritty and gruesome.
I have one more thought on the difficulty of travel, which is that because Mythic Bastionland looks like a hex crawl, which people may feel like I know what this game is because I've played another hex crawl game, you might have a preconception that an important part of the game is beginning in one place and slowly kind of mapping the realm or discovering the realm. Whereas in Mythic Bastionland, the realm it's not hugely difficult to get from one side of the realm to the other side of the realm. But the next time you make that journey, it could be a very different experience because the realm changes. There are myths coming and going and shifting, and you're making your mark on the realm, or other events are making their mark on the realm. So the idea that the travel has to be grueling in order to slow down this process of discovery, I don't think that's necessary, because you're discovering it through time as well as through space.
I think, to be fair, one argument for making it a bit more often that there's virtue loss, you have the passion that will regain spirit, and then clarity can be replenished by visiting a seer. And so by reducing virtue, you now have motivation to either play into what kind of knight you are, or give them a reason to visit a seer. So these elements are in the game, and I think the argument would be it's not often enough that they actually make a difference.
Also, keep in mind that you can use a sacrament, or like there are different rituals to regain those virtues, but then still you have to get those from someone, which is like you building out your story there. They have to go to a dwelling and they have to get the supplies for whatever. So in that sense, you're adding onto the story by, a slight virtue loss that they then have to resolve this issue.
I'm interested if anyone ever had a donkey with like a load full of sustenance. Like, I cannot imagine that happened even once.
I think that's a good question for the Discord. There must be at least one person who's had that.
The idea that there's no gold or silver or anything, like there's no rules for money. There's a rule for trade, which essentially says you make an agreement with someone where you do something for them, they do something for you. So anytime you start to get into stuff like, oh, well, this game would be easier if we have sacraments or sustenance, whatever. But to get those, it opens up some other little messy situation of bring my nephew with you, make him your squire, and then I'll give you this thing. Everything that you do has some consequence, which is very interesting.
And I think, listeners, these consequences change your realm, and that is why it's not that useful to write a script for your realm. And that is why we prepare some stuff for the Unscripted Realm. Listeners, that was our second episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you guys next time. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.